Part 1. The Silence Before the Storm. He was born on a cold March night, when the wind howled like a wounded beast through the stone alleys of Fuentellados. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, as if the sky itself sensed something was stirring, something neither holy nor damned but fated. Francisco José de Goya y Lucientes came into the world not with a cry, but with a silence so deep that his mother, Gracia, feared he was stillborn. Only minutes later, his lungs awakened with a ragged gasp, and the newborn screamed as thunder cracked over the arid hills. He would spend his childhood among whispers. His father, José Goya, a gilder with rough hands and eyes dulled by ambition denied, moved the family to Zaragoza, a city filled with the echoes of Roman ruins and the cold weight of Catholic grandeur. It was there, amidst the echoing cathedral vaults and dark wooden chapels, that Goya first saw angels painted in agony and saints bleeding gold. And he felt something awaken. It was not joy, not awe. It was hunger. A slow, gnawing obsession that wrapped around his soul like the silk of a spider's web. At the age of 7, he was already drawing in the margins of his schoolbooks. By 10 he was skipping mass to study the cracked frescoes and forgotten churches. At 13 he began copying works from the great altarpieces of Zaragoza, not as an apprentice but as a thief of light. His father disapproved. Art was no trade for a man. But Gracia, stern, devout, half-mad with dreams of sainthood, saw in her son's furious sketches something divine. Or cursed. She began to speak of visions. Of shadows that moved when Francisco painted. Of crucifixes that bled when he slept. At 14, Goya was sent to apprentice with José Luzon, a local painter. Luzon's studio smelled of turpentine and ancient dust, and the old man moved with the careful fragility of someone already half-buried. Francisco hated it. The technique was stiff. The rules suffocating. He craved violence in brushstrokes, not balance. He wanted paintings that screamed. By 17 he had already begun to rebel. He painted a saint with the eyes of a corpse and was beaten for blasphemy. He began dueling in back alleys, chasing danger with the same fervor he chased pigment. He was rejected from the Real Academia de Bellas Artes in Madrid. Twice. But rejection only fanned the fire. In 1770, at the age of 24, he fled Spain altogether and crossed into Italy, penniless, starving, and filled with a kind of sacred rage. There, among the ruins of empires, he studied the ghosts of Michelangelo and Caravaggio. In the twisting alleys of Rome, he drank with whores and whispered with priests. He painted peasants as gods and angels as murderers. One night, in a tavern filled with smoke and heresy, he etched into a scrap of parchment. The sleep of reason produces monsters. He would never unsee what followed. Part 2. The Court of Masks. By the time Francisco Goya returned to Spain, he no longer resembled the boy who had left it. The gaunt fire in his eyes had deepened. The charm he had once wielded like a dagger now sliced with precision. He moved through the streets of Madrid like a ghost in daylight, unnoticed but watching everything. The city reeked of perfume and rot. Beneath the Baroque splendor, Spain was crumbling, outwardly devout, inwardly diseased. The nobles still dined in silk, even as the people starved. The church spoke of purity, but its walls hid darker things. Goya, ever the chameleon, painted what the world demanded, and what it feared. His entry into court society was quiet but cunning. He began with portraits, first for lesser nobles then for rising stars. His brush flattered but it did not lie. He painted vanity with honest light, greed with unspoken judgment. And strangely they loved it. They mistook his cruelty for cleverness, his satire for style. But one woman saw through him. Maria Teresa de Bourbon, the Duchess of Alba. She was fire wrapped in ice, dangerous, adored, and impossible to possess. Goya met her at a masquerade, her eyes painted in soot, her lips curved with practiced scorn. He approached her not with reverence but with challenge. "You wear death well," he said. She smiled without warmth. "And you wear madness like a rosary." Their affair was inevitable, not born of romance but of mutual fascination. She let him paint her in ways no other man could, barefoot in mourning, hand on hip, eyes meeting his as an equal, not a subject. But love, if it was love, did not soften Goya. It sharpened him, gave him fuel. His reputation swelled. The court watched with a mix of admiration and suspicion. The Inquisition whispered his name. And still he painted, saints and whores, kings and cripples, all with the same unflinching gaze. In 1789, Charles IV ascended the throne, and Goya was named painter to the king. It was a poisoned gift. The royal family posed in pompous splendor, unaware that Goya's brush revealed more than velvet and jewels. The king, dull-eyed and soft-jowled. The queen, hard-lipped and calculating. The children, distant, arranged like props. His most infamous royal painting, Charles IV of Spain and his family, was both masterpiece and mockery. Critics would later say it looked more like a butcher's family portrait than a royal one. But no one dared stop him. Not yet. Part 3, Silence and Sirens. It began with a ringing. A high-pitched shriek in his ears, like the whine of invisible insects. At first, Goya thought it was exhaustion, the cost of late nights, poor wine, and courtly performance. But the sound grew louder. It became a wall between him and the world. Then came the dizziness. He collapsed during a portrait session of a minor marquis, his brush slipping from his fingers as the world tilted. When he woke, he could barely hear the doctor speaking. The court whispered of fever, poison, madness. But the truth was worse. He had gone deaf. At 46, in the prime of his fame, Goya was struck silent by the world. No music. No laughter. No whispers behind his back. The silence was not peaceful, it was suffocating. A vacuum that swallowed meaning. Even Maria Theresa, once his co-conspirator in chaos, began to drift away. She feared the man behind the mask, the one now locked in a silent scream. But Goya did not fade. He transformed. What had once been satire turned savage. He retreated into a different kind of work. Los Caprichos, a series of nightmarish prints etched in acid. Gone were the powdered wigs and genteel banquets. In their place, witches feasting on corpses. Monks groping blindfolded girls. Skeletons dancing in noble garb. Beasts wearing the faces of men. One image in particular became infamous. The sleep of reason produces monsters. A man slumped over a desk, his head buried in his arms, while owls and bats and ghouls claw at the air above him. It was Goya. He had painted himself. The Inquisition saw the prints and bristled. He was not just mocking the nobility, he was mocking God. Accusations crept in like spiders. He was called atheist, heretic, demon-touched. To survive, he played the fool. He claimed the prints were warnings against vice, not celebrations of it. He withdrew them from sale. But the damage was done. Something inside him broke, or perhaps was finally freed. He moved to the outskirts of Madrid. A country house with peeling walls, known as the Quinta del Sordo, the house of the deaf man fitting. It was here, far from the court's prying eyes, that Goya began his darkest work. He painted directly on the walls, no commissions, no audience, no pretenses. Just visions. They were not meant to be seen. But we saw them. Part 4, The Black House. By the time Goya closed the doors of La Quinta del Sordo, the world had changed, and so had he. The war had come. The Peninsular War, brutal, bloody, and merciless. Spain bled under Napoleon's boot, and Goya watched the country dismember itself from within. Cities burned. Priests were hanged. Innocents executed. And still he painted. But not as before. There were no oils for the salons of dukes. These paintings had no titles, no explanations. Only terror. He covered the walls of his home with nightmares. One room displayed a Sabbath of witches, a towering goat-headed figure blessing a congregation of the damned. Another showed a dog half submerged in ochre-colored earth, gazing upward in mute despair. But the most terrifying of all was Saturn devouring his son. There was no myth, no metaphor. Just a monstrous old man with wild eyes and tangled hair, sinking his teeth into the bloody remains of a child. Hands grasping, fingers torn, mouth wide in horror. And yet, it was not horror for the victim. It was for Saturn himself. It was Goya. This was no allegory. It was confession. He was the devourer, the consumed, the witness. No longer deaf to the world, he now heard what no one else could, the howling beneath history, the rot beneath virtue. The house became a tomb of voices only he could hear. Visitors noticed his appearance deteriorating. He no longer shaved. He wore black even under the burning sun. He muttered to no one. At night, the servants heard him arguing with unseen guests, pacing before his paintings, laughing, weeping, cursing God. And yet, there was method in the madness. Goya was painting what Spain refused to see. Not kings and saints, but the soul of the nation. Raw, fractured, in pain. The black paintings weren't just private, they were prophetic. He knew history would return, and when it did, it would dig through plaster and find these ghosts. They would see Judith beheading Holofernes and ask, who was Judith? And whom had she slain? They would see two old men eating soup and ask, why do they smile like corpses? And they would see Saturn and understand, This was the world eating its children. Not just Spain. Humanity. In that silence, in that self-imposed exile, Goya found truth. And it terrified him. But he could not stop. Not until the walls were full. Not until there was nothing left to say. And when that moment came, Goya fled. Part 5. The Exile. In 1824, Francisco Goya, old and frail, vanished from Spain without a word. He left behind his house of nightmares, La Quinta del Sordo, and the black paintings entombed within its walls. No fanfare. No goodbyes. Just silence. He sailed across the border to Bordeaux, France, a city he barely knew in a country that had once been his enemy. But he no longer cared for flags or kings or borders. He had seen what they all led to, the guillotine, the firing squad, the grave. He was 78 years old. Sick. Haunted. And yet, still painting. In France he became a ghost in plain sight. Locals noticed a hunched Spaniard wandering the streets with a sketchbook, watching but never speaking. At cafes, he'd sit for hours, scribbling furiously as if trying to trap the soul of a passerby before it escaped. His drawings grew stranger. Gone were the noble portraits or elegant poses. Now came grotesques, toothless beggars with melted faces, blind men stumbling through alleys, leering dancers with smiles too wide. All scribbled in black ink as if burned into the page. He called them los disparates, the follies. No one knew what they meant. Some laughed. Others recoiled. But Goya never explained. He had nothing left to explain. Once, a young Spanish student named Antonio Bruguera visited him. Bruguera described the old man's home in Bordeaux as filled with mystery and silence. Paintings leaned against walls. Charcoal dust floated like ash. And in the center, Goya, nearly blind, with trembling hands, still drawing. Still listening to the ghosts. Even in exile, Spain haunted him. He would sit by the window and whisper to himself in Castilian, or curse under his breath in Aragonese. He wrote letters to friends back home but never sent them. He kept them in a drawer like relics from a country that no longer existed. But there was one comfort. Leocadia. A younger woman rumored to be his lover, or his nurse, or both. She came with him to France. She kept him fed, clothed, sane. Her daughter, Rosario, called him abuelo, though Goya had never acknowledged any formal family ties. He painted her too, not as a Madonna, but as a woman of shadow and silence, half-turned, half-vanishing. In 1826, knowing his time was near, he requested permission to return to Spain. The government said no. He was too dangerous, even deaf, even dying. So he remained in Bordeaux. And on April 16, 1828, Francisco Goya died in his sleep. No last words. No grand canvas. Just breath and then none. He was buried in a modest grave. Later his body was exhumed and brought back to Madrid. But his skull was missing. No one knows where it went, or who took it. Some say it was stolen by phrenologists, desperate to understand the mind that could conjure such horrors. Others say it never left France, that it still whispers beneath the soil of Bordeaux, where Goya watches the world he once painted decay all over again. But the truth? Goya left his body long before death. He had already buried himself in his work. In his madness. In the black. Part 6. Legacy and Damnation. Long after Goya was dead, Spain tried to forget him. Not the court painter, that Goya they celebrated. The one who captured kings and duchesses with velvet accuracy. The one who made Spain look powerful. But the other Goya, the one who painted Saturn devouring his son, who etched nightmares onto copper, who defaced his own walls with demons and shadows, that Goya frightened them. They didn't know what to do with him. In the 19th century he was called a madman. A warning. A ghost of war. In the 20th century he became a prophet. Modern artists, Picasso, Dali, Bacon, devoured his work like starving wolves. They saw in Goya what others feared, truth unmasked. When Picasso painted Guernica, his howl against fascism, it was Goya he echoed, the 3rd of May, the blood, the open mouths, the execution without mercy. Goya had shown the world what war felt like, not what it looked like in uniforms and medals, but in screams, in mothers cradling corpses, in twisted limbs and blind terror. His black paintings, once hidden in his private home, were eventually transferred to canvas and placed in the Prado Museum in Madrid. Visitors don't know how to look at them. They wander into the dim room and fall silent. There are no explanations on the wall. No context. Just the brushstrokes of a man who had nothing left to lose. In Saturn devouring his son, Saturn's eyes bulge like boiling eggs. He tears at flesh like an animal. The sun, already half-eaten, reaches toward the viewer. There is no glory here. Just hunger. Just fear. Just time. And yet, there is beauty in the horror. Goya's brush, even in madness, moved with elegance. The shadows breathe. The colors, blacks, ochres, blood reds, feel alive. Like the walls themselves are remembering. People stare then turn away. Some laugh nervously. Some leave. But no one forgets. Critics call him the first modern artist. Not because he was fashionable, but because he saw behind the veil. He painted not what people wanted to see, but what was there. He tore away masks, kings, witches, priests, soldiers. He painted them all, naked, rotting, absurd. And then he painted himself. Over and over. An old man in shadow. Watching. Waiting. In the 1980s, a new theory emerged among art historians. That Goya never lost his mind. That he pretended to escape censorship. To scream in symbols. To speak truth through metaphor when words were forbidden. If true, it makes him not only a genius, but a revolutionary. A double agent of sanity. In a small room at the Prado, there's a painting that often goes unnoticed. It's called The Dog. Just a yellow-brown smear of a hill. And at the top, the head of a dog, barely visible, half-buried, looking upward. There is nothing else. No trees. No sky. No hope. Just the dog. And the void. Many call it the most haunting image in Western art. Because we are the dog. And the void is everything else. Goya didn't paint to please. He painted to remember. To warn. To scream. And we, centuries later, are still listening. Still staring into the abyss he left behind.